100 more DPS than this other person, even though their crits were the same. Why was that? Well, it was because they got luckier on their damage rolls. And that can have a profound impact on some classes, especially classes that have a smaller number of large, heavy-hitting abilities.
Yeah, to echo that, so just as an example, I'm looking at some Marauder calculations right now, and the components to the damage are your hilt damage, there's your bonus damage, and there's the standard damage. And if you go with the lowest possible, the hilt damage is the only one that will fluctuate from use to use. If you go with your lowest possible hilt damage, you'll get an expected hit of around 6,000. And then if you go on the other end of the spectrum with your highest possible hilt damage plus a critical hit, you'll get a hit of about 13,000 on that ability. And it's just so, a 2x swing there. And, it's unlikely that you'll get the lowest possible example, and it's unlikely that you'll get the highest possible example, especially more than once. But one manifestation of that can be huge.
Yeah. And so this is actually, I think, what introduces some interest into the game, right? Where, you don't want everything to be 100% predictable all the time. I mean, progression raters, and especially, we'll talk about reliability of damage, reliability of healing, and being able to make things predictable and whatnot. But at the end of the day, this is still a game that we want to have something to react to. We want to have something that we as players have to interact with, so we're not just performing a multiple choice test once every 1.5 seconds, right? And the variance in damage, as annoying as it can be when you're trying to get that record parse, or you're trying to beat the damage check in second phase council, it's really, really, really valuable to have that kind of variance, because it lends interest, right? It makes it so that you have to keep your eyes open. It makes it so it's worth looking at your meter both during and after a parse. It makes it so it's not 100% predictably, reliably boring. And so I think that's kind of cool.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you can make it really simple to model and mathematically represent, but then it's most likely not fun to play.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it would be like playing Mathematica.
Right. All right, so let's move on. We want to talk about augments. We know with 3.0, the transition has been that whatever stat you're choosing to put in as the primary stat is 52 for the numeric value. So like primary stat or power or crit or whatever, or even the defense. Is it still endurance as the second stat for all the DPS healer, and then tank is power? Or have they changed that?
Yep, that's all the same. Really, there's been no difference in the gear, other than the amount or the magnitude of stat that you benefit from. The names, the descriptors for all of that are still the same.
Actually, that's not 100% true. The tanking gear, the tanking gear is really interesting, because the tanking gear, we have, for the very, very, very first time in the history of Star Wars, we actually have optimal tanking enhancements available for top tier gear.
Yeah, I just became aware of this earlier this week. What exactly was it previously? So it's not like the Bulwark and Bastion anymore? What's different about these new enhancements then, or these different enhancements?
So there's two things that are different about it. So to set the stage, right, the old enhancements that were the best in slot that you could get were Bulwark and Bastion. And Bulwark and Bastion were as low endurance as you could get, and then secondary and tertiary stat were fairly high, with especially tertiary stat being defense and absorb. So those were as good as you could get. But in the game files, we knew that there were these other enhancements, sturdiness and immunity, that were even lower endurance, slightly lower secondary, so shield, and higher tertiary, so defense and absorb. And because shield is less valuable than defense and absorb, and endurance, of course, is, I mean, depending on who you talk to, we can talk about this later, but endurance is much less valuable than secondary and tertiary for tanks. These were fantastic enhancements, and you could craft them at the grade 28 level, but you couldn't obviously craft them at grade 34 or even grade 36. You could craft them now, but you couldn't then, and you certainly couldn't get them from drops. So this was in contrast to the DPS, who, if you look at adept and initiative enhancements, those are actually low endurance versions of equivalent enhancements, which have some of their tertiary budget pushed into the secondary and more into the endurance, right? So I forget the exact names of them, but they're like insight enhancement or whatever.
Yeah, proficient and
Yeah,
I don't
proficient.
know what the other
Yeah,
one is.
like those. So this is the equivalent of all of the tanks being stuck with proficient enhancements for the entire lifetime of the game, and finally having access to adept enhancements. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, one of my guildies just mentioned that this week too, and I guess I should have been aware of that, but I was shocked to see that, and then I was very pleased to see that it actually changed now in Star Wars, because it's should have changed.
So these are like the A and B type ideas that we had in the past.
These are for enhancements, really. So it's a little different than how the mods.
So it's primarily within the enhancements. Okay, they're just actually giving you some variant in stat distribution without being obviously retarded to use one or the other.
It's giving you a better option that you can get, an option that we always knew was there, that we wanted them to give to us, but they never did. It would be like, so remember back in Campaign Gear where all the gunslingers were stuck with patron armorings? And that was really, really annoying. And they had to use patron armorings because that was their set bonus. And, there was just all this cunning that they were missing out on. Remember what it felt like when 3.0 came around and all the patron armorings were removed and you actually had skill armorings for a change. This is the tank equivalent of that.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
It's a good change.
So, I guess a basic question before we move on beyond augments. Should everybody still be statting for primary stat if they're not a tank?
So, I do not believe so. I did some math on it just this week. I know others have done it as well. From my point of view, it appears that power is superior than primary stat. And there's two reasons why this has changed. First, and I think the most significant, is that every class lost their plus X% to primary stat. So, 6% for jugs and sorks and 9% for mercs, snipers, operatives.
Nobody's getting a percent bonus to their primary stat?
Correct. Nope. Nobody gets that percentage bonus. Everybody still gets the 5%
Wow.
class buff by the Sage Sword class buff, but nobody gets any other increase there. So previously, you had the comparison of, primary stat affects critical chance and your damage bonus, and power only affects damage bonus. And so previously, you had the comparison was like 0.23 power versus 0.228 from primary stat plus the incremental critical chance that primary stat would offer. And so because the damage difference, the bonus damage difference was so minor, that's why it always made sense to go with the primary stat. For some classes that didn't have that increase, like a Marauder Sentinel, it was maybe a little bit more specs dependent. But now that the 6 and 9% primary stat increases have been removed from the game, it becomes a little bit simpler. So the math is now 0.23 from power and 0.21 from primary stat. That 0.21 is inclusive of the 5% class buff from Sorks and Sages. So we've got that big change, which relatively speaking, reduced the attractiveness of primary stat augments with respect to how much bonus damage they contributed. The other big change, or the other thing that will continue to change, is that the stat budget for primary stat has increased. So 36 gear is much more common now, or 186 tier, I guess. 192 is available, 198 is available. All of that drives up your overall primary stat. And as you get further and further up the curve there of primary stat's contribution to critical chance, you suffer from the diminishing marginal returns there. So it becomes less beneficial. You get less crit from, 400, from 3,600 to 4,000 primary stat than you do from 0 to 400 primary stat.
So we are entering values that you can attain for primary stat that the crit contribution is being hurt by that diminishing return. Like, that crit contribution is not actually increasing nearly as much, so the power is more powerful.
Yeah,
sort of.
That's a simplification.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, it's kind of, all of these are really tiny factors that play into each other, right? So there's there's the fact that we're kind of getting up there in terms of diminishing returns for primary stat. I mean, we haven't. Correct me if I'm wrong, Oofalong, but I don't think we've actually hit the half value for primary stat yet, just because the half value is so high. I mean, the rate of return is very, very low. Um, so we haven't really hit the kind of points that you would be getting to if you had like 400 surge, for example. But we're getting up there, and so that's having an impact on things. And
also the fact that nobody's got their 9% or 6% bonus means that they're not matching damage bonus to damage bonus, the power contribution. So therefore the crit is slightly less valuable from the primary stat rating. I imagine does that mean that crit rating actually might have a little bit more value on its own?
Well, that's an interesting question too. Maybe we can come
very
back to that one.
Okay.
Right.
We've got that in the outline. We'll get back to it.
Because I mean, it's a great discussion to review, but it is spec dependent. So generally speaking, guys, for DPS and healing, although I take that back, I'll speak for only DPS because the healing coefficients are different. So I think my methodology for evaluating which two augments were better was looking at the comparative incremental critical chance and damage bonus from primary stat versus just the bonus damage from power. And I did some math, made some assumptions around what 1% of critical chance is worth in terms of DPS and what 20 bonus damage is worth in terms of DPS. And then I say, okay, great. It looks like power augments are superior for all DPS specs, because generally speaking, I think I use the numbers approximately 1% of critical chance is worth about 20 DPS, and 1 point of bonus damage is worth 0.8 DPS. And generally speaking, I think those have to be in the ballpark of being accurate. For instance, I don't think that a Marauder would benefit 20 DPS from a point of critical chance, and a Gunslinger would benefit 150 DPS per each point of critical chance. So as long as they're directionally accurate, it was not even close in my calculation then that power augments were better than primary stat augments.
Yeah, so there's been a whole bunch of testing, and there's been a whole bunch of math for very specific classes on this. I know QWERTY has been doing a lot of work on this, which has been great. There's a couple of other people on the forums. Alienus, I know, is building a model for Shadows and Assassins, and there's someone else who I really apologize for forgetting your forum handle, but I don't know. You do great work, whoever you are.
I think it's Tacey Mosi. Is that who you're thinking of?
No, that's QWERTY.
That's QWERTY.
I was thinking of someone else who posted recently on the Ebon Hawk thread for deciding this, and also was posting on the Shadow and Assassin subthread. But in any case, for some very specific classes that have very high surge talents and or very high crit talents, it looks like primary stat, like that tiny crit contribution from primary stat, does push it up a little bit higher. So for example, QWERTY was doing some theory crafting for Deception, which has surge talents on basically everything. Not quite as universal as Fury, but pretty much everything, and some crit talents, which also pushes up the value of crit. And in QWERTY's math, primary stat came out over power in 198s by like 7 DPS, but it was very, 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 very close. I know some people have been looking at Sages and Sorks. People have been looking at power techs. So there's various different things in here. I did some work on operative DPS, specifically lethality, because I don't my knowledge of concealment is very low right now. And from the testing that I did and from the math that I've done, both of which are somewhat preliminary, right? So I did about 2 or 3 hours of parsing with both, and then I did some spreadsheet work on the side. It looks like power augments are better for lethality operatives, but concealment with the crit talents and the surge talents, maybe main stat, it seems unlikely. So it varies a lot from spec to spec, depending on what you have in terms of the base bonuses that you're working with.
Excellent. So they actually have built in a lot of these baked-in stats that we were default taking before when there was a tree system. When it comes to the discipline system, they've actually created some diversity within the disciplines themselves to make this a little bit more confusing, which is a good thing, I think.
And to add to what Keyboard Ninja just said, the difference is going to be relatively minor. If you've already invested